All right, good morning. Thank you for joining us for what we hope is a lively discussion around, I think, quite a pertinent topic in today's business environment and especially in our industry. I'm Joanna Catalano. I run the iProspect business here in Asia Pacific, and iProspect is one of a number of global brands that is part of Dentsu Aegis Network. So thanks again for joining us. And it's really strange, in case any of you have not spoken on a silent stage, it's really strange to hear yourself speak like this and know that you're coming through someone's headphones. So I guess I just wanted to start this morning by giving you a little bit of context on why this is an important subject for us at Dentsu Aegis Network. We're a global network, so I'll start there. And I think when you work globally, that kind of is the first point at which you need to think about how you can be inclusive when it comes to incorporating a variety of cultures and building a sort of work environment that really allows the fullness of each individual to shine through. So, I mean, we are in a creative business as well, and we need to make sure that we can optimize for this. And we want to make sure that the sort of flavor of each of our brands also comes across in its richest and best format. So it's imperative for us to have an environment where individuals thrive, where they engage, and I think that we believe that frameworks around diversity and inclusion are really central to cultivating that culture. We made a commitment earlier this year to start with what we're calling an audit of our current state of play, because we felt it was necessary to truly understand what is happening within our company, right? We wanted to know, how do employees feel? Do they actually feel that we have a diverse and inclusive environment? And so we're starting with an audit, and we will take that audit, and then when we get the results of it, there are three things we want to look at. The first is we want to make sure that the strategy that we adopt across Asia Pacific is actually tied to business priorities. We want to make sure that it's not just diversity for diversity's sake, but that we are actually driving better business performance as a result. So I think that is the first. The second is our people agenda. So it's really critical that as we think about talent not just from it coming in through the pipeline, but also how that talent stays with us. I think I'm new to agency. It's actually my first job working at an agency, so it's been an interesting experience for me, but I mean, we're a talent business, so we have to take it really, really seriously, and I think that, if I may say so, it's not something that agencies have been particularly exceptional at, so we need to get much better at it, and we need to think about the role that diversity and inclusion plays in that. And I think the last is, when we think about what our diversity story is and what our strategy is, it needs to be underpinned by our values. We spend a lot of time in building out a set of values, and the way that we implement our program needs to reflect that. So the last thing I'll say is one of the kind of critical decisions that we made is that this needs to start with our leadership. It's very, very difficult, I think, to get sort of sustainable benefits if you don't have a set of leaders that understand the value and that drive it with their managers, their team leads, and all the way down to the individual employee. So we want to make sure that we are motivating our staff by leading by example, by role modeling diversity and inclusion, and so we've decided to start with our leadership team. I'll just quickly, I don't want to get too theoretical, but I just quickly wanted to share a little bit of the what that we're doing when it comes to this. So you can see one of our goals as a network is to have a 100% digital organization by 2020, if you don't know this about us. And then obviously, as I mentioned, we're a full service network that optimizes capabilities that is drawn from across our brands. There are a few different things that I will touch on when we mention diversity and what that means, right? So you can kind of see on the left, the first is, are we actively seeking different perspectives in decision making at the team meeting level, right? Often you can be in a meeting where there tends to be a dominant small group of individuals that lead the thinking, and we want to make sure we avoid that. The second is, are we actively encouraging different thinking approaches, right? So are we making sure that we're not just having an environment where there's a bit of groupthink. We actually want the diversity because the diversity will make us better. Are we supporting a flexible, or what we now call at Dentsu Aegis, agile work environment, right? And then are we actively driving gender balanced, and not just gender balanced, because diversity for us is not just gender, though it tends to be where we start, but it's also culturally diverse, right? We're in Asia Pacific, and I think we need to be very, very sensitive that we draw on the richness and the fabric of the cultures in which we work. Are we collaborating effectively across our brands? And then the last sort of what is, are we building an inclusive environment where everyone can reach their potential, because it's a very individual journey. So that's a little bit of the what. In terms of the how, I guess there's sort of 3 points that I'll touch on. Again, the first is very relevant to our topic today, which is about unconscious bias. So we will, over the next 18 months, implement a very comprehensive unconscious bias program, which will start with our leadership team, our executive team actually, and then we'll scale into every country down to the individual level, so that we increase the self-awareness of what this is and what it means to us as individuals and as a business. The second is allowing for greater flexibility in job design and a work approach. As I mentioned, we launched this concept of agile working. We also have piloted in Australia, I believe, what is a best-in-class return to work program. So we're really looking at how we can support not just women, although sometimes it does tend to affect women more, but also men as they get to that point where they start having families, and there could be implications in terms of career paths. And then the last is that, again, as I mentioned, making sure our diversity and inclusion strategy spans across all dimensions of diversity, not just gender, but also cultural, religious, sexual orientation, and also being inclusive from a mental health perspective. So that's a little bit about us. I just wanted to make sure you had some context as to why we care about this and what we're doing to address it. And I guess I also just want to give a shout out to Campaign Asia, because our journey sort of started with that. And if you're not aware, Campaign Asia in February of this year launched the Mandate for Change. If you haven't seen it, please do take a look at it. And again, kudos to Campaign for putting skin on the game. This has been, and someone, there were many remarks, I would say, at Cannes this year about, oh yes, it was another year of diversity. Well, let's not keep having to say it's another year of diversity. And so it was great that Campaign this year actually said, well, we're going to track you, we're going to measure this, we're making you sign a charter. Our Asia Pacific CEO, Nick Waters, signed this and is holding us very much to delivering upon what we signed up for. So thank you to Campaign for getting us going on this journey. So just a quick one, I'm going to introduce you to a selection of great individuals that we have joining us. We have Lisa Santorelli, who's with us from the BBC News. She's going to moderate for us this morning. She's a news journalist who works across TV, online, and radio. She's based in Singapore. She specializes specifically in business reporting, and over the last 6 years has covered some of the region's biggest stories, including the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Thank you, Lisha. The second is Dr. Zoe Kinias, who is an associate professor of organizational behavior at INSEAD Business School. Zoe is also, in addition to being associate professor of organizational behavior, she also is the academic director of INSEAD's newly launched Gender Initiative, and has done research looking at diversity and resiliency, which has been published in leading psychology and management journals. The third is Sean O'Brien, who's with us from Dentsu Aegis Network. He's the CEO of our MKTG and Posterscope brands. He has over 20 years of truly global experience in the industry, working across the world, and has run full-service advertising, branding consultancies, so both global and also very diverse in terms of the nature of his work. Sean has been a long supporter of diversity at Dentsu Aegis. He's also one of the founding members of our diversity board, advisory board, which is called One at Dentsu Aegis. And the last is Joe, I'm looking for you, Joe San, who is a head of strategy at Dentsu X, one of our media brands. And Joe is been working in marketing and developing content strategies for some very small brands such as Disney, Fuji Xerox, Singapore Airlines, and Santorelli. Thank you all for joining us today for this discussion, and I'm going to turn it over now to Zoe, who's going to talk to you a little bit about her research.
So hello everyone. You can hear me? This is very weird, very, very weird. So thank you all for coming, and I'm going to move a little bit quickly through some slides that will probably look a little bit familiar to you. What I want to start by sharing with you is that we still have very dramatic underrepresentation of women in top leadership positions globally. I have some numbers up from the CEO proportions in the US, Canada, and you may remember these cute articles that came out a couple of years ago in which the New York Times, the Financial Times, and one of the big Australian newspapers, they counted up the number of CEOs in their country's top businesses, and they compared the number of women in total, with any name out there, to the number of men named John, and Peter, respectively. John, and Peter outnumbered the women. So when we think about numbers like this, the extreme underrepresentation of women, we think about the absolute numbers of women in the organizations that have potential to move up women into these top leadership positions. And we also think about the pipeline, right? So what is the path to top leadership in these organizations? And in thinking about this, we're interested in upwardly mobile roles as well as just the overall number of women. So I want to show you figures from the Catalyst. We see this pyramid structure of where the women are, bottom heavy, many fewer at the top. This is in the United States, Canada, and some research that I did with the Financial Women's Association of Singapore shows that we see something quite similar here in Singapore as well. Now, the really critical part of the story, in my perspective, is not just that women are underrepresented at the top. It's also that women are dramatically underrepresented in the roles that are most upwardly mobile. So what I've shown you in this figure is a split between the women in core business functions as opposed to support roles 2 and 3 levels below top leadership in these organizations. So the women who are managing directors in support functions, this is HR and other similar types of roles, are never going to become the CEOs, right? So we have this, in addition to the total number of women in top roles being underrepresented, we also have what the economists call gender labor segregation. So even in the same organization, if we have a decent number of women, they're segregated into different types of jobs, and the ones that men are in are more upwardly mobile. So thinking about this a little bit closer to home for us in terms of technology, we also see a very similar pattern with respect to the representation of women working in technology firms as to whether they're working in technology or support or other roles as well. So even when we look at the absolute numbers are fairly low in lots of these organizations, those who are working in the actual technology functions are below 20% in most of our top tech firms as well. So what's going on? Why do we have this gender labor segregation? One potential answer to this question is men and women are just different. We have different preferences, we have different ideas about what we'd like to be doing, we identify ourselves differently, and you know, there's something innately different about us. There's this really obnoxious book you may have heard of. It's called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. Not my favorite book. And the reason it's not my favorite book is it suggests that not only do we belong in different roles even when we can manage to get into the same organization, but we're not even the same species, right? There's something about this like different types of alien story that is really gets under my skin, and it troubles me even more when I look at what the data actually show with respect to gender differences. And even with well-established gender differences, so for example, there's a personality dimension called agreeableness. It's basically how friendly or how nice you are. There are established gender differences. Women on average are more agreeable than men. We can talk about why we're that way, is a whole nother story. You know, we're socialized to be that way. We're brought up to be that way. But even for this, where there's a reliable gender differences, that means that there's a mean difference between women and men. Women are on average higher than men. If you look at these distributions, you see that this whole filled in blue range is all of the men who are more agreeable than the average woman. So we say men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Men are like this and women are like that because sometimes there is actually even a mean difference between men and women. But that doesn't mean that we are categorically different. We're from different planets. What that tells us is that we have an incredible ability as humans to categorize, to pull apart differences, and to exaggerate them in our minds. This is what we talk about as stereotyping. And so when we're talking about unconscious bias and the depth of bias, on the surface, we might ask a question about the representation of men and women. Now, we start with this question, and we get under the surface. That's the tip of the iceberg, is the numbers of men and women in different roles. But when we go down to the bottom of the story here, many of us social psychologists believe that a lot of what's happening is connected to this unconscious bias, these beliefs about men and women. And so there's large bodies of research showing that our mental models of what a man is and what a woman is are not equivalently aligned with ideas about leadership, technology, analytic ability, and management. So to give you an example from this body of research, this is a study where they asked lots of business people to say, what does a manager look like, what does a good manager look like, and what do men and women look like? And 71% overlap between men in general and being a great leader. Only 10% between women in general and being a great leader. So our minds have this ability to pull apart and connect man and leader and woman with other stuff, right? So when we think about this, we want to pay attention to what happens between these mental models and what we see on the surface, which is the representation of men and women in our organizations. And when we think about this, there are the opportunities that are made available to people is one of the points, but that's also pretty close to the surface. What happens is, when we have this mental sorting or categorizing going on in our heads, the first thing that happens is what we observe. I don't even hear what you say because I'm not expecting you to say anything great. So everywhere from the level of not even hearing what you say, to not remembering that you said it, to not putting it in your file, to not recognizing it, to not having it be aligned. And when you add up all of these different stages at which the bias can play in, you end up with the sorting and the pyramid structure that we started with in the beginning. So to put this into a more academic, sorry, I'll go quickly through the academic model. An academic model, the representation of women is influences our mental models, which then in turn influence the opportunities, which in turn influence the representation of women, and we go on and on through this cycle. Now, when we want to think about intervening on this cycle, I've been talking a little too long, so I'm going to go quickly. There are things that we can do on a personal level, first of all, and one of these things is what Joanna mentioned, which is become aware. So if you're not sure if you have gender bias, there's this great test called the Implicit Association test. There's a website put out by Harvard. You just click on a link and it lets you take the test. You can do a self-assessment. Nobody knows what you found out, but you know yourself. So that and taking responsibility for what we do once we become aware of the bias. So on an individual level, there are things that we can do. On an organizational level, we want to follow fair and best practices, and there are lots of guidelines that we know can improve our ability to make good decisions when we are aware that there can be bias in the system. So we don't have to cure all of ourselves of having the bias. That might not be realistic, but what we can do is put into play best practices that inhibit the ability of the bias to influence our decision making. Anything we can do to inoculate ourselves against making these mistakes. The next point that I wanted to talk about in terms of what we can do is particularly connected with media. So I was very excited to be here sharing with you all today because I see the media industry as having a crucial role to play in the creation and reinforcement of the mental models. So if we want to think about what we can do to intervene on the whole system, I see the people here having a really phenomenal ability to make change. So we can talk more, of course, about all of these details as we get into the panel. I just wanted to go back to the model that I presented here and reinforce that this can be a model of reinforcement of a biased system, and we can also intervene at various stages within this model to create more virtuous cycles and to shift the system going forward. So I have a nice little red arrow to show how the process works. And with that, I think it's time for us to shift into panel discussion. So I will pass to Lena to move us forward. Yeah?
Everyone, let's hope this mic works. Let's just get seated with the panelists. Zoe, Joanna, and Joanthan. The mic's not working?
Do you have a preference?
Yeah, do it here.
Don't lose your balance, Sean.
Yeah, Sean, don't fall off the chair, okay?
So thanks for that really fascinating presentation. Just really briefly before we get into the panel, why do you think that gender bias, unconscious gender bias, has become such a hot topic now, when maybe 5 years ago it wasn't really on anyone's radar?
That's such an interesting question. So we were actually talking yesterday about how we can think about there being significant global progress in the last few years that has been followed by some squeeze back, if you will. And so I think that both the combination of the progress that we had seen in the last, from about maybe 4 to 2 or a year and a half ago, giving us, I think, a lot of people hope and thinking that things are really moving forward and we can start to pat ourselves on the back and feel like we're starting to accomplish things, followed by a lot of upheaval and a lot of much more blatant sexism and the unveiling of a lot more blatant sexism than we had really been recognizing, I think, previously.
Okay, I think you're alluding to Trump and Clinton.
Trump and Clinton is one of the things that I'm alluding to, but also a lot of the scandals that have been coming out of the Silicon Valley, for example. And these are things that we used to say a couple of years ago, you know, we used to have to worry about Mad Men sexism, and now we're worrying about these more subtle things. And now we have to really be realistic that we're dealing with both.
Okay, well, on that note, we're going to focus this panel on gender bias, unconscious gender bias in the workplace and business world, just because we don't have much time. But I'm just going to name 4 companies: Tencent, Samsung, Baidu, and SoftBank. What do these companies all have in common? Anyone can shout out an answer. Aside from the fact that they're Asia's biggest tech companies, they all don't have a woman on their board, none of them. So why do you think that this problem persists today, especially when we have so much discussion? Joanna, let's start with you.
Where do you want me to start? You want me to start with answering the board question? Or?
Let's start with the top leadership in the boardrooms of highly successful companies.
Yeah, I mean, Look, boards are probably the one place where I will say, and it came up yesterday, where our global head of HR asked me if I was insinuating that I was pro-quota, with a little bit of, I hope, undertone of, I hope you're not suggesting that. I said I'm not. However, I think the boardroom is actually the one place where we probably need it, if I'm honest. If I look at, and I was against it at first as an American. I tend to think, okay, yes, and we won't go into recent politics, but I tended to, up until recent politics, think that, you know, we were fairly democratic. And I was a bit Pollyanna, but I actually think sometimes you need a push. And I think that the board, I mean, just think about it from a corporate governance perspective. Think about how many companies have been dialed up for absolute rubbish corporate governance. This has nothing to do with gender. It has to do with mental models. It has to do with ways that these structures have operated for a long time. I mean, Herminia Barra from INSEAD talks a lot about the differences in networking between men and women. And when we look at boards, I mean, there are mates that are on the board. I'll use the Sheryl Sandberg example. You know, Sheryl has, in the US, made a very, very conscious, you know, she got on boards and she's made a very conscious effort to make sure that the big boards in the US are now staffed with women, and I don't think we've seen that here in Asia. So I do think quotas are not a bad thing. I think in countries like the UK, where they have implemented, you've seen a big change in the structure of boards. I think it's not, you know, it really takes a very deliberate effort.
Okay, so you mentioned quotas. In the Asia Pacific region, which is, I'm trying to localize it here.
Yes.
Japan and Korea are the worst offenders when it comes to gender representation in the workplace. But we are seeing countries try and change that. So India in 2013 introduced a law where you have to have at least one female director. And in Malaysia, we had Prime Minister Najib say that he's going to name and shame companies that don't have women on their boards by next year.
Right.
Now, Joanthan, you've done a lot of work in Malaysia. Can you speak to as to whether you think that these approaches from the government rather than from the companies are going to work in this part of the world?
So I've got to be very careful, make sure I don't say anything that gets me banned from any country.
Your own especially?
My own especially. So I am Malaysian. I think I really appreciate that sentiment from the Prime Minister, but it tends to be at odds with some of the things his cabinet says at times about gender roles, and I hope he keeps that cabinet in check. Snap. But in general, I think you need to. We need to begin to question some of the cultural changes we're introducing. There is a wave of ultra-conservatism even through Malaysia, through the Philippines, through Indonesia that's happening right now. And it is quite frightening to see what that's doing to notions of gender roles, to notions of women who lead. And it might get worse before it gets better for a country like mine. When I think about Dr. Zeddy, who just recently retired, she was the governor of Bank Negara, one of the most prolific bankers in Asia, I don't know if you can get another Dr. Zeddy from Gen Z or the millennials with the culture of what's going on. The conversations on everything from underage marriage to what we're talking about in terms of women's roles. So I love the name and shame thing. Go ahead and do that. You should do that with yourself. But a little bit of making sure you're backing that up when it comes to the education system, the policy changes you're introducing, the new laws that are being debated when it comes to these rights. That's important. And freedom of choice is important. All of these things need to be safeguarded and protected, because you can name and shame all you want to, but the path that gets a female leader to where she is starts long before the day she's put on the board. So it's a full picture, and he has more say and more power over that than I think he gives himself credit for, him and his cabinet. So, put your policy where your mouth is, sir. Love you, but put your policy where your mouth is. So that's going to be very important.
Well, we'll get to that millennials point you raised a bit later in the conversation. But Sean, you've had a lot of experience internationally. You've worked in Europe and in Asia as well, in markets like Japan. So I want to draw on your experience on how you find doing business there and how you deal with managing teams and recruitment when it comes to these gender biases. What you experience in Europe versus what you've experienced in Asia, because we do see that Asia is actually the worst region after Latin America.
Yes, and I've worked in Latin America as well. Look, I think it has to start at the top. And I think culture does have a major impact in terms of how organisations work. If you look at Japan and Korea particularly, they are very much male-driven organisations, and a lot of work is done outside of the office. A lot of work is done in bars and clubs, and it is very much a boys' network, which is very difficult for women to break into. That has to change from a cultural perspective and from an organisational perspective for there to be more equality in those markets. You take another market like, say, Thailand, for example, and I don't particularly like the term of traditional male values and traditional female values, and I think a lot of research debunks that anyway. But Thailand is much more feminine in terms of its values, and as a result, you see an awful lot more female leaders in organisations in that marketplace. And the style of working in somewhere like Thailand is very different to, say, a Japan or a Korea.
Yes.
I think as well within those markets, because I worked in Thailand for a while, and one of the people that I admire the most was my CFO in Thailand, because she was definitely the heart and soul of the organisation. Everyone looked to her before anyone would do anything, no matter who was the CEO, no matter who else was a supposed leader in the organisation, almost for approval, almost like, are we okay? We're okay. Okay, yes, we agree with you. And I think that's amazing, but it is also part of that culture, which is very communal, people only wanting to work in a place and an environment that they're happy with. They'd rather not work than work somewhere that they don't believe in and they're not comfortable with. And we have to drive that from the top across the region, and particularly in markets which are very male-dominated.
Okay, so you mentioned two very distinct cultures, Thailand and Japan, and Zoe, in your presentation as well, you said that we all have biases inherently, and the only thing realistic we can do is try and adjust them. But Joanthan and Sean, you guys come from the advertising world. You guys have to claim a lot of responsibility for some of the gender stereotypes that we are seeing and reinforcing these unconscious bias. So can you speak to whether we're seeing a shift in the industry, whether people are being a lot more conscious when they're strategizing or thinking about campaigns?
So I work in creative strategy, and it's about unpacking narratives and really talking about what these values are that go into it. So whether that's talking about female empowerment in the context of Alice in Wonderland for Disney, or whether it's talking about, what exactly, where are the minds in talking about shampoo? We had to figure out what those things are. I think the depth at which we're having these conversations, the way in which we're breaking these narratives down, that's shifting, that's changing. And we talk about millennials in particular, so many things are in flux that nothing is just taken for what it used to be anymore. You have to have those, it's now a business imperative for you to have those conversations and narratives, because you can't take so many things for granted. We still have a long way to go, but you see us starting to begin to question those conventional stereotypes. Are they still relevant? Do they still exist? And granted, this might not necessarily be led by a sense of morality, it's led by a sense of the bottom line. Maybe the stereotypes don't have resonance anymore, right? But it's happening, and it could happen faster. Everything could happen faster. But these are the things that are sort of happening. You have to begin to lead those conversations on, is this really the direction you want to go to? And when you don't, not just in issues of gender, but in issues of culture as well, you see things backfire, like the recent Watson's campaign in my home country, right? When you don't properly dissect, they were leveraging off of a fairy tale.
Sorry, I don't know this Watson's campaign. Could you?
Oh, it was racially insensitive.
Oh, okay.
Was there like blackface or something?
It's not big, but it was playing. It was playing on a traditional trope and a fairy tale. No one bothered unpacking that fairy tale to see if it holds up for this audience and this generation. So we're doing that now because it's becoming a business imperative, and those narratives are beginning to shift. You can't bank on those tropes anymore, not the same way you used to.
Sean, do you have anything to add?
I think all of us in this industry, in the wider media
everyone
industry,
in this room,
everyone in this room, clients, agencies, the media, etc., have a responsibility. And I think we've been a bit lazy. Storytelling often, especially when TV was much more powerful. I've got 30 seconds to get a message over. People tend to jump to stereotypes as a shorthand for telling a story. that's a very lazy approach, and we need to change that. I think hopefully, as data enables us to communicate much more on a much nicher perspective and more on a one-to-one basis, those stereotypes are not going to work. They don't work when you're sitting in a bar talking to somebody to use those stereotypes. It won't work from an advertising perspective. That will change the industry, and again, to your point, it will change the industry because it just won't work, not because somebody goes, this is wrong. We also have a moral responsibility as an industry as well to change these things, because we do, you know, maybe we overplay our influence, but we are playing in a space that has exposure to very wide, very young audiences, and we do impact on their biases as a result of that.
Well, let's talk about money, okay? Because one of the clearest ways we can see the gender bias play out has to do with the pay gap. So, based off research, we're seeing that finance is probably the largest that we're seeing the pay gap between men and women. And actually, one of the only industries you see women out-earn men is in counseling. But tech... Counseling. I wonder why.
Yeah, exactly.
I've been good listening, yeah? Okay, so... But we're seeing a lot of headlines come out of Silicon Valley, as you mentioned earlier. So, Joanna, could you talk about why tech has such a big problem?
Yeah, I mean, look, Zoe showed the numbers. Silicon Valley has, for almost in the entirety of its existence, operated a bit as a bubble, right? And Zoe showed the numbers. She listed the tech companies. I mean, it was 2014, for those of you who don't remember, I remember, when Google released its first set of diversity numbers, and it caused very significant waves. There was pressure for a long time. They finally shared them. I was there at the time, so I can tell you that the number of talking points that you got as to how you use those numbers were very lengthy. And it showed that there was 83% men versus 15% women in those tech roles. And I think you showed a slightly higher number, which probably is a more recent number, and it shows you the very small amount of progress that we have made. I mean, I've worked either in tech, up until I switched to agency side, I'd been either in tech or working with tech companies probably for the greater part of my career, and they tend to be fairly male-dominated environments. And it's not just, you talked about the pay differential. As a manager, you saw it. You had to correct it. You had an obligation to correct it. It was always fascinating to me, and especially because I started in the US, then I went to Europe, and then I've been in Asia for the last 10 years. It always, if you're in the US, I would say probably a slight more willingness when it comes to women versus men to raise attention. You go to Europe, people, and it's not just women, men as well, when it comes to negotiating or saying, hey, I don't think I'm equitably paid, that's not a conversation. You come here, forget it, right? So I did a fair amount of coaching of young women. And I think in general, there's a culture in tech, right? Each company has a very unique culture. The culture at Google is not the same as at Apple. It's not the same as at Microsoft. I mean, it's interesting sometimes when people cross over, but because they tend to be very strong, and they tend to attract a certain profile, and that profile tends to index on a certain set of, one of the things in my time at Google that was always really interesting was women being called up for coaching on presence. What does this mean? Can you tell me? And so I think that, it's always been this way. It continues to be this way. And I don't remember if it was you, Zoe, or you, Lisha, who talked about, I think it was you, that talked about this last year has been a year that's really rocked us in terms of the number of, news reports that have come out on harassment. Right, and it's not just the stories. It's saying this man at this firm. So there's, it's been a bit of a tipping point. I think it's at a state now where women are just like, enough.
Well, let's take a look at something that Zoe had in the presentation. You had a picture of this giant iceberg, right?
Yeah.
And so with the CEOs and top-level managers at the top, but actually it's really ugly at the bottom. And you've got this big pipeline of women, be it an hourly worker at McDonald's, okay, maybe not McDonald's, but you get my point, to someone else just stuck in the middle, trying to push their way up. But how are they supposed to broach it without coming off the wrong way as managers, as people who've handled hiring?
From my perspective,
push up through the
mentorship is
pipeline.
really important, and I think, again, diversity in mentorship is really important. It shouldn't be guys necessarily mentoring guys. Having cross-gender mentors, having different cultures mentoring each other in terms of how they can develop their careers is really important. And that does challenge unconscious bias in a number of different areas as well. And the more diversity you have around career development, both in terms of hiring, in terms of evaluations, the better. Because I think, traditionally part of the reasons why this has happened is people hire a vision of themselves. And it reinforces their own value, and then they go and hire another vision of themselves, and you end up with organisations that look like it's a bunch of robots. And that could be it's all male, it could be they're all Ivy League, it could be they all come from a certain type of background that influences their way of thinking. All of this ladders up, from a business perspective and making it successful, it's about diversity of thought in its widest context, of which gender is a big part of that. And I think from a leadership perspective, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're creating an environment where everybody has the ability to ask those type of questions, but are also guided in terms of the best way to do that, the best approach.
Sorry, but are you all in agreement, all four of you, that this change has to come from the top down, not from the bottom up or from the middle?
It has to come from the top. So there are levels of support that can come at each level, but I think it is very unrealistic to think that the disempowered will be able to empower themselves in organizations.
Yeah, and I was just going to add on, I think to Sean's point and to Zoe's point, because I've sat at that table during talent review, right? And where you look at your talent, you say, who's going to get promoted? And I can tell you right now, if you don't have senior leaders sitting at that table that know their people, that can speak to their people, that can advocate for their people. I can remember one example of looking at a male versus a female candidate where that female candidate had done significantly more in terms of delivering results. And it was only because someone had that data to say, let's actually look at the data. Let's look at it objectively. And so I think that's why, you really need to, it starts with removing, and I think you had it right, not just when you are evaluating talent, but also when you're recruiting, trying to remove that gender element, but then also when you start to think about promoting and moving your talent along, making sure that it's strict.
If you forgive the cheese, it begins wherever you stand. Right? So if you don't find yourself at the top, then no, it's not about beginning at the top. Wherever you stand, wherever you find yourself, you got to do something.
Yes.
So one example is, it behooves you to actually build a diverse team, especially in a market like this one. So if you look at Southeast Asia, the markets are so fragmented, right? If you have people with just one frame of reference, one experience, you can't cater to this. You go outside, you look at the work that's on those boards. There are very few agencies in here that cater just to Singapore. So you need to bring that out. One thing that causes sometimes that discrepancy in pay gap is when you're transitioning from one of those local markets into the regional hub of Singapore. Men have an easier time negotiating that salary difference to adjust for cost of living, to adjust for everything they want to do than women do. So sometimes you find yourself in a position where if you like someone, you want to keep them in there, you coach them before they walk into HR. You tell them, dude, ask for what you want, okay? And make sure you ask for what you want and push. And I do find, forgive me, that I have to nudge female candidates more than I do male in that conversation. So I will actually get that out of you. Ask me for what you want. So in certain respects, yes, policy changes, organizational behavioral change can start at the top. But from an individual perspective, it starts from wherever you stand, wherever you are, you pick up and you go. And you don't wait for anyone to give you permission to do that.
Briefly though, is this changing with the millennials? The millennials are the workforce of the future. They have very unique character traits. Maybe they won't have any, maybe they're going to break all these biases. Maybe they'll break these.
No, I think the one ray of hope is everything's in flux. For a millennial, you cannot look at someone ahead of you and say, I want their job, because it won't exist by the time you get there. So if everything is in flux, why not question your own cultural mores, the things that you've accepted but not explained? Common sense can be your enemy at times, and sometimes it's your friend. So actually having those conversations about how you operate, how you work, you're going to have to do that anyway, so why not bring in your unconscious biases into that mix when you're questioning how to disrupt your own career, your own work style, your own management style. And that's the ray of hope for millennials. Otherwise, it's just Kim Kardashian and the end of humanity. So, you got to bring in some hope. But if you're shaking things up anyway, why not shake this up? You know what I mean?
Yeah, let's shake this.
Exactly.
Okay, so you mentioned Kim Kardashian. Let's talk about each of you have to give a female role model, breaking these unconscious gender biases, and you're not allowed to say Sheryl Sandberg. And who else am I going to eliminate? I'm going to eliminate Hillary Clinton as well. Okay, so a female example. It can be personal.
So I'll go first because I know who mine is. I am a professor. I know that's not everybody in this room's aspiration, but it is. I remember very, very clearly the point at which I decided that I wanted to do this for a living. And that point was when I was in my second year of college, and I was sitting in a small seminar class, and the professor was a Mexican-American woman. I studied in the southwestern United States, and she was, enlightening us, first of all. And the second thing that she did is she brought in a personal story of something that had happened in her house with her family. And I had this moment where I said, she's like me, and I could do that. Yeah. And it was something about her ability to do her job well and her ability to be real that just struck me, and it shifted the trajectory of my life.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo that. I don't think it's necessarily these big personalities that you see in the press. I mean, look, Sheryl Sandberg is a brand. It's a very carefully constructed brand, as is Hillary Clinton. But I completely agree with you. I would say it's been multiple women along the road. For me, it probably started when I was 16. I happened to also have a teacher who was highly influential just in terms of my thinking around what was possible to achieve, and it's kind of stuck with me in sort of every organization that I've been at. There's been at least one person who said, no, you can do this. This is absolutely possible, and was there and supported, and so, and I think that is why that notion of mentor or role model or sponsor, and they do play different roles, are all really critical that we build them in.
Sean?
Again, there's multiple, but I think, I'll go back to my CFO in Thailand when I worked there. She was, it sounds a little bit stereotypical insofar as she was in a very senior role within the organisation. Her personal life, she was looking after two very, very sick parents. She was trying to keep her husband's business together whilst he was sick. She was trying to bring up kids. No one would know that in the professional environment until you got to know her as an individual. For me, why she was inspirational is because she's one of the best leaders I've ever seen. She wasn't the CEO, but she was still one of the best leaders within the organisation. She always put her people before herself, which I think is a sign of a really good leader, and I think often women are much better at that than men. I think men usually are, look, it's all about me, I'm really good. She would always put her people first. She was totally trustworthy. She walked the talk. She said she would do something, she would do it. You knew that she was genuine. And she was just a great human being. And I think that's, the balance of working and just being a great person is really important. And she managed that wonderfully. She taught me more about leading than anybody else and anybody who's been more senior than me.
Okay. And quickly, Joe?
Yes, very quickly. So I'm a fanboy of Grace Tsai. She founded the Impact Hub here in Singapore. And I participated in one of their incubators with PACT, and she gave me some great advice at the time. Watching her and watching a lot of other female entrepreneurs come out of this region has been amazing. She's also a countrywoman of mine, so I'm a little biased. But she's amazing, and watch her along with the careers of so many of her peers. I think it's amazing to see what's happening.
Okay, well, thanks very much, guys. And mine, of course, is my mom, but she's not here in the audience today.
Hi, Mom.
We are out of time, but we are now moving to the question and answer segment because I know you all have something burning inside you to ask one of the panelists. You're going to have to shout it out, I think.
We're out of time.
No time?
No time.
Okay, we've got no time. Just come up to them afterwards. But thank you so much, Joanthan, Zoe, Joanna, and Sean, for your insights. And have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.